somehow I had to go on my own show Friday night and deny that I don't believe in germ theory. No, I get it. I do believe in germs. I get it that germs are bad. Germs and viruses cause disease. What I've always said is that Western medicine takes into account too little that it's also the terrain. In other words, germs, yes, they can make you sick, but you have a better chance of withstanding that if you're in good shape. In other words, the terrain, the analogy would be mosquitoes in a swamp. Right. Mosquitoes breed easily if there's a swamp. So if your body's a swamp, the germs breed easily. But it doesn't mean I don't believe in mosquitoes. Sure. Yes, and the same thing. It doesn't mean I don't believe in vaccines. I understand that in some situations, vaccines are very important. You know, should we, inoculate third world kids against malaria or whatever they can be? Of course. It's a cost-benefit analysis. For that, it makes sense. But for me, living in Beverly Hills to get a swine flu shot makes no sense at all.
You'll be fine. Do you remember when you first became, I mean, you were like, you're like 13 years old, the late 60s, 69, 13, 14 years old.
I was 13 and 69.
So when political upheaval, the news, it seemed there was some sort of revolution happening, or at least that's how it was represented on television.
Masturbating. Yeah. Believe me, when I was 13, none of this.
But when do you remember when you first became aware of what was going on?
Yes, but see, I grew up in this news-oriented family. My father was a radio news guy, so it was sort of always around. By the time I was that age, I was really pretty aware. 12 was the big year, because that was 68. That was the conventions, the Chicago Convention with all the violence and the assassinations, Martin Luther King, Bobby Kennedy. 67 they called the Summer of Love. 68 was the Summer of Hate. Mm-hmm. That was a bad, bad time. But it was interesting, and I remember watching those conventions with my parents at home, and it was dramatic television, even for a 12-year-old.
How did your folks explain that to you? How did they contextualize what was, because they were obviously aware of the outside world and they weren't afraid of debate and questioning.
Right.
What did they say to a 12-year-old kid when Dr. King is killed and Bobby Jr. is killed and all this is happening?
That's a great question, but I don't remember. I mean, they were typical, not typical, but just very dyed-in-the-wool liberal Democrats. So I never really questioned what their view was. I always knew what it was. Nixon's an asshole. So, no matter what happened, it really came back to that. The Republicans are bad and Nixon's an asshole.
Well, I remember the first time that I heard George Carlin, it blew my mind as far as questioning and being political. Was for you to get into comedy, because you could have become a journalist, which you kind of are now, but to get into comedy, do you remember where that began?
That began very early. I think that began because my father was a good living room comedian. And you find this often with comedians, that it's something that sort of has to gestate through one generation. The father, very often. I know a lot of my comedian friends say the same thing. My father was a funny guy. He didn't go that one more step professional, but kids want to be like their parents if they're good parents. I wanted to be like my father. I saw him making people laugh in the living room. Mm-hmm. So I think that's where it began. And then, of course, television is a big influence. I loved Carson, I saw in your bio, Robert Klein, George Carlin, huge influence. I mean, he was a cool dude, long hair and, hippie stuff, and talked about all the stuff, said bad words, They're
like training wheels in a sense, aren't they, influences?
Yeah, and also, when you start, you want to, you're so anxious to be a success and not be left on the road, because there's a lot of roadkill in comedy, that you just latch on to what you think is the model for success. When I was first in the clubs, it was de rigueur, clean material. You have to have clean material to get on Johnny Carson, and you get on Johnny Carson enough times, then you get a sitcom. Because we saw that happen with people like Robin Williams. So that's what I wanted to do. And of course, that was the worst thing for me to do. I did it. Mm-hmm. I got the clean material. I went on Johnny Carson. I got sitcoms, and it led to absolutely nowhere. It led to me in 1990 going, oh, I'm a failure. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until a couple of years later that I sort of reinvented myself as what I am, which is what I always should have been, instead of playing the office creep on Bringing Up Chunky.
Well, that's a crazy...
I was actually very good at it.
Yeah. It's a crazy spot to be in 1990, when you've put a lot of work into a certain path, and then you're not a 21-year-old kid, and you're sitting there going, I don't have a job.
Right. And I did that. I mean, that absolutely happened to me. That happens in almost every career. You know, there's even Frank Sinatra, which is sort of depicted in The Godfather, that time of his career when, you know, he had been a big star from 1939, but in the early 50s, he couldn't even get a recording contract. You know, everybody hits that point where it's like, uh-oh, is this it? And then you're going to come back. And that, for me, was the early 90s. It was the hardest time in my whole career because I had been on 3 or 4 sitcoms and I'd done movies, not good ones, but, you know, something. I mean, I had a burgeoning acting career, but, you know, you got to be awfully lucky in the acting business. You got to get into stuff that's a hit. And
which could have nothing to do with your performance.
Absolutely. That's what I always told myself. It had nothing to do with my performance.
Stick around. We're going to come back more with Bill Maher. We'll go down to best and worst and see what Bill thinks of a bunch of stuff when we come back.